is a way of sort of guiding reflections, some questions to think about, and quotes from Merton that you might want to reflect on. I'd appreciate it that people who now have 2 copies of the syllabus would leave them on the way out so that we have some for others to go along. Now, it's interesting, Merton's fascination with the man. You know, books coming out about him all the time. It's interesting, and I know last week I think I stressed the idea that Merton didn't have it all together himself, that he was a man in process and struggling. Is that me? It's the latest in technology. It's fantastic. I just came from a technology conference the last 2 days in Dayton, and they would be interested in this new technique at a center that is studying these things. Anyway, last time I was talking about Merton in terms of the struggle and a lot of his difficulties in life, and making the suggestion that he really didn't have it all together, and he's not exactly a model for how others might want to live, but he is so brutally honest and willing to face the questions, and in many ways symbolizes the 20th century, much as Cardinal Newman probably brought together many of the major questions of the 19th century, so Thomas Merton has wrestled with the kinds of problems that our contemporaries, ourselves, are trying to deal with. And so I've set the lecture series up on the basis of the conflicts that many of us experience and that Merton wrestled with. So last week we talked about action and contemplation, prayer in the busy life, and how we might bring those together. And tonight we want to talk about the whole question of nature and technology. Now, as always, we want to try to figure out how that question is real and personal for us. For some, it might be as simple as figuring out if they want to take a computer course or not, or whether they're going to remain afraid of them for the rest of their lives. Oh, for some people, it's a very searing kind of question that has to do with how we deal with the threat of nuclear weaponry, how we deal with the products of technology, such as the nuclear bombs. You might think of it in terms of the problem of how we deal with pollution. We have this factory system. We have an industrialized society. What do we do about pollution? For some people, it's very personal. It is, how do I get away from all of that? How do I find my time with nature? How do I recover my own natural rhythms? How should I spend my vacation time or my leisure time so as to somehow counterbalance the technological influences that are always impinging on me, living in a fast-paced, urbanized, technologized society? How do I step back from that? How do I get perspective on all of that? How do I get more in touch with my own rhythms? Also, probably the question becomes very personal for us in different ways. Now, here in the United States, there's a whole history to this question that I think it's worth at least sketching out. That is that when people came to this world, to the New World, as they called it, they had a great dream about what this country would be like. And it would be a country in which they would get away from many of the evils that were found in the Old World. One of those evils was, as they saw it, the Industrial Revolution and the factory system as they knew it, the urbanization. And so they came here with a great dream of a new land, the kind of place that would be idyllic, where one could live in peace and harmony with nature, where one would be uncontaminated by all of that pollution in the old world. Jefferson's idea was of a country of small farmers, an agricultural country, where we would all have our plot of land and be rather self-sufficient and live close to nature. Throughout all of our history, we've seen that ideal. It's talked about in terms of the garden. This was to be the garden of the world. If there was going to be any manufacturing, it would be scattered around, and we would do only as much of it as we had to do to somehow ease the burdens of the agricultural life. You look through the world of literature, there's always that theme coming back of an Eden, paradise, return to that kind of world. It's a world that's simple, that's neat, in which the rhythms of nature are what guides one. And then there's always the conflict. It's, and some authors speak about it in terms of the machine in the garden. The machines came and invaded the garden. They messed up our nice country, our nice world. Well, the machines brought all kind of technology. At first it was good. They would be labor-saving devices, but then they began to take over, and then people had to move from the farms, and we gathered in urban areas. And we began to produce our own type of pollution and the fast-paced life of the city and all of the things that go with that, the things we currently associate with the core of the city, the drugs and the street life that the children have to go through and so on. So the garden got invaded by the machine. And it set up this ambivalence, I think, in our psyches that we still carry with us. The train represented that. Some people talked about the train as the octopus that was grabbing up everything. The trains went through the farmers' fields and messed up their fields. Whitman talks about, hearing the train in the midst of meditating in the woods. The train, you can hear the sound of it, and it's invading his nice, neat world of nature. On the other hand, there was, as I say, an ambivalence, because the train also was seen as having a power to link together, had a power to pull this vast continent of ours into some sort of unified whole. So you see that ambivalence. Kids love trains, don't they? They love to see them, or to give them model trains, and so on. There's a fascination about trains. And yet there's another way in much of our thought that the train is an evil force. It's a beast. It's an octopus. It's something that gobbles up and brings us technology. You see the same sort of ambivalence about the automobile. We want that car. It's independence. We make our own way. And yet it's what pollutes the air. And as my father always told me, that it's the automobile that keeps the average man poor, young man. Remember that. I think that's when he didn't want me to get a car. So our automobiles have that same sort of ambivalence about them. Causes many of our problems, gas shortages, and messes up the world economy because we use so much oil and so on. Well, and I suppose our modern version of this is the computer. Again, the ambivalence. So many people love that computer. They tell me, get a word processor, work with a word processor. That's how you write articles and so on. It's fantastic. Save you time. Do your bills on it. They love it. And other people sort of think, geez, we're getting totally computerized. When I'm trying to get my name off of a list, I can never do it because it's on the computer. For years it's that way. There was a priest who lived with me at Bowling Green. He was from Oregon. For the whole time he studied at Bowling Green, he tried to get his mail to go across the street from the university to where we lived. And that whole period of years, it always went to Oregon and then came back. So, people are afraid, I suppose, of the computers in many ways. So, we see an ambivalence about technology, about the machine. In one way, it's invaded our idyllic world. It's messed up our own natural rhythms. It's given us pollution. It's helped create nuclear weaponry. On the other hand, it has eased our burden and helped us cool our houses with air conditioning, give us heat, and simplify some of the hard and difficult tasks of life. Now, when you read through the literature on this, it seems to me that the critique almost entirely comes on the side of opposition to technology. Our poets, I was asking someone in the field of literature in preparation for this, I wanted to read some poets who celebrated technology and who celebrated urbanization. I think we came up with Carl Sandburg in Chicago, and I'm not sure we got much beyond that. Or maybe someone will come up to and tell me afterwards. But surely the preponderance of our fiction, our poetry, and so on celebrates that idyllic life, the rural life, those values of the small farm, or the being in touch with nature. As we're going to see, Merton very much falls into that common pattern. Well, with that kind of background, that's sort of the hope that would resurrect some questions in us, some feelings about our own attitudes towards nature and technology. I'd invite, as I often do, a couple minutes of reflection on this. I'd invite people to sort of think where the problem area is for yourself. Well, how do you deal with this? Is there anything I've said so far that connects in, or you can relate to your own problems with technology? Right, one, I throw out another one in case none of them have clicked so far, one that's probably inescapable, and that is technology, which has produced an industrial revolution, has in turn produced bureaucracy, the breaking down of functions into various parts. So if you can't get into the question any other way, you might think of the problems in dealing with bureaucracy, where you can never get anything done as you would like it to, and it's always somebody else who handles the problem, and you can never find out who that is, or you have to wait in line to do this, or something is wrong that way. So maybe that's still another way that some people might work their way into this problem existentially, so it would be real to us. So I'm going to invite the couple minutes now of reflection, and some of you might want to write down how this problem plays itself out in your own life. Feeling that I said something about this last time. Did I read anything to you about a signed confession of crimes against the state? I can't remember where and when I've said much these days, but if just to give you a flavor for Merton's writings and the way he would go about a question like this, it's an article he wrote, A Signed Confession of Crimes Against the State. And he says, I'm the kind of person who must sooner or later fill pages of blank paper with the confession of secret crimes against the state. And he goes on and says, the very thoughts of a person like me are crimes against the state. Says, I'm trying to convince myself in this way that I am sufficiently interested in the state to hate it. He says, let me confess my secret and subversive desire to accuse myself. I declare that everything I am now about to write will be either true or false. Everything written down turns in the end into a death warrant. This is interesting in terms of his writing, the ironic, sarcastic style that he often adopted, and the ambivalence is built into his writing, the humor side by side with something deathly serious. And then he goes on to make his confession. He says, I confess that I am sitting under a pine tree doing absolutely nothing. I have done nothing for 1 hour and firmly intend to continue to do nothing for an indefinite period of time. I have taken my shoes off. I confess that I have been listening to a mockingbird. Yes, I admit that it is a mockingbird. I hear him singing in those cedars, and I am very sorry. It is probably my fault. He is singing again. This kind of thing goes on all the time. Wherever I am, I find myself the center of reactionary plots like this one. I confess that there is nobody else around because I came here on purpose to get away from the state. I avow in a frantic paroxysm of grief that the state and I are much better off and we have nothing to do with each other. I admit that nothing has happened all afternoon, and that it continues to happen. It is true, I have got my feet in an anthill by mistake. Now we are getting somewhere. I might as well confess that there are ants on the paper as I write. They are determined to take over all the writing, but meanwhile the sun shines, and I am here under the pine trees. While there is still time, I confess that there are ants on the paper and a fly in my ear. Honestly, I don't care. I am sorry. I have no desire to get rid of them. If I had a grain of true patriotism, those flies would make a difference. I beg the forgiveness of the state. I am shattered by the realization that I have never attributed the sunshine to its true cause, namely the state. Then he writes at the end, the deposition of reliable witness. He has come to the wood with his shoes in his hand and with a book. He has sat with papers and a book. He has done no work, but stood and sat in the sun over and around an anthill in the sound of a bird. Yes, there are ants all over the sunshine running very fast. Well, that is sort of typical Merton in one genre of his writing. I mean, biting satire. Oh, I mean, this whole idea that it is a tremendously countercultural statement, right? I mean, he's spending a few hours with nature. And I mean, the point of it, of course, is that, I mean, this isn't acceptable. I mean, he should be working hard. He should be involved in the scientific, technological progress of the society. And he's not doing it. And so he's saying that, admitting this terrible crime here. Very countercultural kind of statement. In other words, what we're going to get in Merton is somebody who really takes off after this world of technology and celebrates something far different. When Merton begins to analyze the problems with technology as he would see it, first thing that he brings out really is the complexity that it brings into our lives. Well, you get all of the labor-saving devices, and you have to go out and find someone to fix them. You know, you have to always know how to be able to get them repaired. You know, you get in a building that it's got air conditioning, and you can't open the windows. I mean, there's no way to open the windows and let anything else in. Well, and if the air conditioner goes bad, then there you are. So often, I guess we've sat in this room freezing to death or warm and so on. In other words, he's trying in various ways to see how the technology begins to bring complexity into our lives. It sets up a whole system where we need experts to run everything for us. Long before the modern things that Robert Bella is saying and Alistair McIntyre about the rise of the managerial type in the society, that is, the expert who knows how to get things done, and so we are almost entirely at their mercy. So only certain people know how to fix things or to run this computer or to get something else done. So we become terribly dependent on all of those people. We begin to need the experts. We begin to expect that. We're looking for the expert who can tell parents how to raise their children. Probably because a previous set of experts took away their intuitive sense of how they might go about that constructively. He thinks that the rise of technology has helped to set up the success-oriented culture so that there's sort of only one way to rise on the ladder. It's to gain this kind of expertise, then be able to have it so other people have to pay for it or pay you in order to have these kinds of abilities and qualities. He thinks it's helped to set up the bureaucracy that we described before and that we become reliant upon. He thinks that even enters into the religious world. So today we think that maybe if we get the right manager into a parish, we're going to figure out how to make it work. Or if we get the flow chart right or the staff organized properly, everything then will have a live and vibrant parish. No, so what he's suggesting to us really is that technique takes over in the technologized society. Technique becomes more important than what else is going on. So if we are in a time management seminar, we're probably going to get a whole lot of practical advice of how to manage our time. And maybe not a lot about our attitudes or perspectives towards it. Now, even in the prayer life, that's one of the reasons Merton would not write about techniques of prayer. And when he did write a letter, as I mentioned, to a friend about techniques, he insisted that he not publish it or tell anybody about it. And also he said that technique for him got in the way of what ought to be happening. Technique took over from attitude. Process took over from what really counted in life. So Merton's response to all of this is a call for simplicity. A call to get back to the essentials of life. He wanted us, in his words, to build on the vital connections that already are present in our experience. He wanted us to build on the natural bondings that we already have. One could put it this way, perhaps, instead of running around looking for a whole bunch of new friends, that maybe one would try to get closer to the friends that one has. Try to enter into real relationship, to get some more depth going there. It would be a call to return to the natural bondings of family, to realize our dependence on family members, to cultivate those relationships, to put more time and energy into making family life work in this modern world of ours. Merton was a man who needed this simplicity in his own life. You recall that he moved around a lot. He was born in France, and he was brought back to Long Island and with his grandparents, and then after his mother died, then he goes back over to Europe again, and he's traveling around with his father, and he's living this very mobile kind of life. And then he ends up back in New York City working at Columbia University, and he really had a very strong attachment to New York City. New York City sort of symbolized for Merton this technologized world. Well, and properly so. I mean, we're going to think of an urban area where all the communications network is, fast-paced, and all of the attendant problems that go with the modern society. That was it. Well, Merton, there was a part of Merton that loved that world. He was in it, immersed in it. It was the center of life. I know when I lived in New York for a couple of years, I always felt like I was in the center of the world. Like everything was going on there. If lecturers came from Europe, they stopped there first. Plays opened there on Broadway. The critics in the New York Times would make or break a play. You felt like you were in on the beginning of the action. And Merton loved that life in many ways. It was very much a part of it. And then it was that he felt the limitations of that life. And so it is he's going off to the monastery, joins the Trappists, to get back to nature, to get back to the garden, to get away from the machine, to go back to the primary metaphor that's guided much of the history of this country. Get away from the machine as represented by New York City and get to the garden, the monastery, carved out. And then when he gets there, he finds out that they're remodeling, and they got all these machines going. Well, and he can't get away from it again. And then they're involved. They got to produce things, and so on. So he's back in the world of technology, trying to get his books published, and so on. So Merton, that becomes this the hermitage bit. So he has to get even away from the monastery. Now the garden is invaded by the machine, even in the monastery. So now he's got to get off into the hermitage, away from all of that. And even after he gets out there, I'm going to read you something later on, then he's even invaded by jet planes that fly over. Reminds me exactly of Whitman in the forest saying, hearing the locomotive off to the side. Now here's Merton much later in his garden, the hermitage, and here's the plane now invading his space. Technology won't leave him go in a way or let him have his quiet period. Merton was not at ease with technology. He never learned to drive a car. That's something I had in common with my mentor, Carl Ronner. Never learned to drive a car. I mean, well, you can imagine living in New York City, I go on subways and all that, fine. So one time he was in the monastery, he thought that, well, maybe he ought to come to terms with the technologized world. Come to terms with the automobile. And so he tried to get one of the brothers there to teach him how to drive a car. This was his great effort to come to terms with the machine. And so the brother showed him and so on, and finally Merton was ready to solo, and he got in the car and started out, and he ran right into a pole. Ran it right over. That was the end of his experiment with the machine. Never drove after that. So we're not dealing with a man who was terribly at ease with this world. Although he understood that other side of that part of the American dream where the machine was introduced to help us somehow. So when he was going along in his life, he wrote so much, corresponding with 1,500 people and writing all these books and everything. And his hand, he had some skin problems, and it was very painful for him to write. It was at that point that someone brought him a tape recorder. And he was fascinated by that. That was fine now, because that represented the possibility of continuing to get his ideas out without going through this painful writing business. So Merton, in his own life, his life story has all kinds of ambivalences, but it is largely slanted in the way of seeing technology as being the demonic force. And of course, that's epitomized by the nuclear problem, which we'll get to in a while. So what Merton says is, to us, and to himself, which he always was striving throughout his life, is get back to simplicity. Get back to a world that undercuts this technological world. So, for example, in prayer, Merton would say something like this: to try to pray is already to pray. The real goal of contemplation, he saw it, was simply to rest in the presence of God. Meditation was only a technique. Don't get hung up on the technique. Cast the technique aside if it's not working. What counts is to be resting in the presence of God. So, in other words, prayer isn't about meditation. Prayer is about relationship to God. And always the danger of mistaking the method, the technique for the reality. So Merton would say, and we live in a world, of course, a lot of people in the room at least, who have learned a spirituality that probably centered on technique, and where the technique becomes almost the end in itself. It's a very great danger for us Catholics to fall into that. We have so many rituals and so many set ways of doing things, all these institutional matters. Sometimes we can begin to think that those are the reality, when all of those things are simply means. We celebrate the liturgy, not just to have a nice-looking liturgy that's technically fine, but only as a vehicle to open up the depths of our spirit. So, in Merton's term, that we can rest somehow in the great God. Merton liked to talk about the importance of delighting in the world of the senses. Merton understood the importance of pleasure, bodily pleasure, in bringing us closer to God. He wanted us to get in touch with our natural rhythms. Some authors have said that after he moved out into his hermitage, his writing started to take on a different character. And the word touching, the word touch, to touch, started to come into his writings much more. It's out of that period that we get this idea of him just simply observing, listening to the mockingbird, or watching the ants, touching the trees, gaining pleasure in just those very simple kinds of things of life. It was a matter of living an unhurried existence, of slowing down the whole apparatus. Some have said Merton sort of unwound when he got into his hermitage, away from the machines in the monastery and the clutter of that world, that somehow his bodily rhythms took over. So what Merton wants to do is delight in the senses, to feel all of that. He wants us to be in touch, therefore, with our bodily rhythms, with what our body would tell us. That is something that, when we're talking about nature, that seems so important. My mentor, one of my many mentors, I guess, Gabriel Moran, I've said this often, but he said the two worst inventions in history were the flush toilet, which polluted our streams and so on, our waterways, and the wristwatch, which destroyed our natural rhythms, so that we become programmed by this rather than whatever it is that's at work inside of ourselves. So in the spiritual life, people said, well, you should go to confession once a month, or Mass once a week, or say prayers in the morning or at night, or all these particular ways of doing it. And then we had a whole bunch of people who were serious about the spiritual life trying to fit into that Procrustean bed, trying to fit themselves into that framework, and very often failing and saying, well, I try to say my night prayers, I always fall asleep. And I've been trying for years. I always fall asleep. Instead of thinking, well, maybe that isn't the time to pray. Maybe my natural rhythms should dictate I pray at some other time. So Merton's whole plea to us is to learn our own bodily rhythm. It's a matter of, learning when we should fast or what kind of foods we should eat. That becomes so important. Oh, Gandhi had that theory that celibates should not drink milk. Well, we have a modern version of that. One of my colleagues, every time we have dinner together, he keeps telling me, don't drink milk. He's got maybe other reasons for saying that, I don't know. But it's a matter of finding diet, of what works for us, or sleep patterns. So you begin to get this sense that the spiritual life isn't just reading your Bible and doing the hard thing and somehow trying to do God's will by clenching one's teeth, but to find out how we flow. So as the young people say today, we could go with the flow so that we could follow our natural rhythms of doing things. And that would come out in so many different ways. The frequency we celebrate the sacrament of penance, how often we would need to go to Mass, how many hours we should sleep at night, what kind of food we should eat that energizes us or helps us to function, what kind of exercise we need, something that's pleasurable, and so we would keep at it and not give it up after 2 weeks because it's too hard and we don't like it. So this is all part of what we generally call these days the holistic approach to spirituality that recognizes the importance of bodiliness for coming closer to God. Merton wants to reclaim the garden for us. He's sort of a modern-day Thoreau. He wants to go to the woods and find the garden and help us to live in greater harmony than with nature. Now, I'm going to stop at this point and allow a little bit of discussion and so on. With Merton, it's always the question of, what does he say to us? I mean, none of us can go out and live in a hermitage. We might go on a retreat for a few days or a week max or something. Well, what does all this mean to people who get up and go to work in an office and live with computers and all of that? I mean, that's one of the problems always with Merton. Well, the question becomes, how does he speak to us? I hear him very often as a countercultural force, as somebody blasting away like this tremendously satirical bit about a crime against the state. I mean, that's meant to be humorous, It's meant to cut through our ordinary ways of thinking. It's meant to shake us up, see things in a totally different way. Maybe I'm so programmed that I can't step out of it and even find out what my rhythms are. Maybe some people aren't even interested in that because they're so caught up in the wristwatch and the rhythms that other people have imposed on us. And even if we were in touch with them, then what would we begin to do about it? That's the kind of problem that I would see this question of complexity and rhythm and simplicity would bring up. I'm going to invite now a couple minutes of discussion with another person about anything you would have gotten out of this story of Merton or his analysis. What Merton has to say. We find an insight in that could actually be used in the office, on the job, or in our technologized world. Yes.
What we find, I guess it's approaching the whole thing with some sort of humility, so that we aren't so caught up with our sense of controlling the world with our technology. We could lose our contact with ourselves. And if we don't be so externalized through technology that we can't teach the thread of the interior self if we recognize.
Okay, a couple points made there. One is centering on the notion of humility. That one would need a certain humility that would say, I can't just program this world or control this whole world of mine. And the other thing would be to keep ourselves, to be acting out of an inner center, be acting out of some power source within ourselves that we would theologically call the spirit at work within us. So we're not just programmed by outside forces, but the self is operating in some way. Yes? Well, I really think not. I mean, I think for the most part what Merton is telling us is to think for ourselves on that. He wants to cut through the cultural bias. He wants us to be able to step back and analyze our situation to see if it is messing us up some way. But Merton is not terribly good at practical advice. That's not what he's after, of course, and it becomes for us to figure out how to do that. You know, and as I've often suggested to people in the spiritual life, for example, I mean, there's no reason why we couldn't determine our own rhythms better by seeing what works, by seeing what kind of prayer works best for us, how often we should go to confession and all of that. We could do that in that way. And it seems to me, too, that what Merton would prompt us to do is to bring an attitude towards the technologized world as we know it. I think that we should be countercultural people in the sense that we don't think of it as a god, that we don't fall into scientism, think that it can solve all of our problems, so that if we get our technique right, everything will go fine. It seems to me we could bring a critical attitude towards that. You know, maybe, too, we would have to find our way to deal with the bureaucracy that results from the technologized society. We need our patience with that. We could let it teach us something about limitation and letting go. Seems to me maybe that would flow as well. You know, that's the real challenge to me, is I want to say when I try to wind this thing up here, in other words, I have my own line of thought on this thing that is going to end up being much more positive towards technology. I mean, I don't know if that one can live in, you know, there is an alternate view, put it that way, that the technologized world, as Teilhard said, is also a graced world, and that all things are potentially revelatory, including computers. And I see no particular reason to exclude machines from all of that. The question is what attitude we bring to them, whether we absolutize them, make them gods, idols, and so on. So my theology would suggest that absolutely everything is revelatory, even including tractors, you know, or airplanes, and so on. But right now we're still with Merton and his stinging critique, I guess, of what we are about. The other thing, and this is the next section I want to get to, is, of course, his positive thrust as to getting us in touch with nature and reminding us of the power and beauty of nature, to be transparent and to speak about God. That would be the next place to go. Yes?
What was central we've been engaged in what we're talking about as part of the industrial technology and aesthetics. And I think it was a great progress. So, I don't know whether we're ever going to get saturated with technology. But if we do, and I don't know whether we know when we're saturated by things which we want to make us more comfortable, then we all of our technology to make us more comfortable. When and if we get saturated with our technology, maybe then we would have time and the inclination to use this computer to learn how to get along with each other, rather than depending on inventions and transportation, etc., so that we can become more comfortable. I think that to me, Merton on the Merton line for eternity, he certainly started to use which is our most powerful. And we have, I don't think we know how to.
I hope people heard, and I'm not sure that they have, but there's some very insightful points. I take it that one of the most important points that you want to make is bringing in the personal side of all this, both our own particular powers and our own mental capabilities, our intelligence, and so on, and an untapped potential, the real computer or the finest one around. And also the stress you made on the interpersonal, that part of the way to deal with technology is to make sure it doesn't interrupt the flow of communication, the real flow. It says in one of the church documents on communication that communication is not just the conveying of information, but at the deepest level, communication has to do with giving of oneself in love. So a whole bunch of our technology, of course, now is in the communications area. And one is constantly in danger of getting overwhelmed by all of that. Again, I've been working with the bishops on this question and with another group, and all the conferences and talk and so on is always about the hardware and the software and the satellite systems and so on. And what is always needed in those things is to get it back to the point that you're talking about, the interpersonal, that finally technique is at the service of persons. And if we can keep what you said in mind, I suppose we'll be better off. But the interpersonal is what counts. And I would say it in this way, that we live in communion of spirit, first of all, and that the real gift of the real communication is when we're able to give ourselves, share something of who we are with another human being. And that seems to be where the action is. That's at least part of my, what I would get out of your very helpful comments. And I hope people heard the comment directly. I think that time-wise, when people worried about the time, and I have a feeling that some people, I'm trying to think of a comfortable time for people to leave to get home by 9 o'clock or shortly after. That's important to people. It seems to me I will stop sometime between 9 and 9:30, no later than that. My thought is to maybe take another question, then a 5-minute break, and then to compress the material, and then to take another break right to about 9 so that people could leave comfortably and see what questions arise after that. That's plan A. Yes?
More people today are having spiritual, or have time for spiritual get-togethers and such being with nature than they did 10,000 years ago because of technology.
That's the kind of more positive word that I wanted to speak at the end, I suppose. I'm glad you have said that. I appreciate the point. I mean, right now I'm trying to, get the full impact of Merton's critique. And I think very often with Merton, he's one-sided. That's his power. I mean, he's satirical and strong, and he sees a point and he hammers it home. The next day, he might write an article on another side of a question with the same vigor. He did not fall into Emerson's statement about that consistency was the hobgoblin of small minds. Well, he definitely did not fall into that trap. In other words, you find a lot of seeming inconsistencies in dealing with Merton. But I think your point is well taken. I mean, I think there's a positive side to technology that one ought to factor in, at least, as we try to look at this question. I would suggest that we take the 5-minute break at this point. Return after that. my bones. The blue elm tree near at hand and the light blue hills in the distance. The red bare clay where I am supposed to plant some shade trees. These are before me as I sit in the sun for a free half hour between direction and work. Tomorrow is Ash Wednesday, and today as I sit in the sun, big blue and purple fish swim past me in the darkness of my empty mind. This sea which opens up within me as soon as I close my eyes. Delightful darkness, delightful sun shining on a world which, for all I care, has already ended. It does not occur to me to wonder whether we will ever transplant the young maples from the wood yonder to this bare level patch, the place where the old horse barn once stood. It does not occur to me to wonder how everything here came to be transformed. I just sit on a cedar log, half chewed by some novice's blunt axe, and do not reflect on the plans I have made for this place of prayer, because they do not matter. They will happen when they will happen. The hills are as pure as jade in the distance. God is in his transparent world, but he is too sacred to be mentioned, too holy to be observed. I sit in silence. The big, deep fish are purple in my sea. That's from the sign of Jonas, for those who are interested. It goes on in that similar poetic way and being in touch with nature. And of course, again, the point of that is the rhapsodizing. Now, it would be interesting to see whether any of that clicks in or not, whether it resonates. What would it do to people? And I could tell by some people's faces as I was reading that they were drinking it in and probably imagining a similar scene or reflecting on a time when nature was transparent for them. Maybe for some people it would be the opposite pole. They would say, "What'd he say? What's that?" And of course, that's always going to be the case with any poet. It speaks to some rather than others. I guess the interesting thing, if it doesn't speak, would be to ask ourselves at least the question, why? Or maybe as a catalyst for our reflection, are there any ways in which that might move me to become more responsive to nature? What things might I drink in? What would be my own place? When I was down in Bowling Green, I used to take walks late at night, and there was a special tree along a tree-lined pathway. And no matter how dry my prayer life was, I could almost count on being under that tree and looking up at a certain angle up into the dark night, and that it would become that sort of catalyst. Now, I can't speak about that in the same poetic way that Merton could, but when I read this, I at least know something of what he's talking about, I suppose, out of that experience with the tree. That was my sacred place on the campus. Maybe more sacred than the chapel in a way. It was a place where some good things happened in terms of the mystery, the graces of life. And I guess I would sort of hope that maybe this kind of thing would work in that way. Now, you could go back and try to see, well, what are some of the elements here that we would try to cultivate? One of the things is that he is attentive. He's not just looking out a window with a blank stare, but he sees carefully. One of the Buddhist-type meditations is to look at something, a beautiful object like a flower or a leaf or something, steadily and carefully, and to look at every aspect of it. It's a meditation technique. one that's designed to get us in touch with these deeper levels. But Merton notices, he sees. I suppose one of the questions that would result from this is, as we walk through our day, do we see nature at all? Does all pass us by? We notice the leaves yet this fall. So one of the meditations I guess would be to look closely here. The solitude seems important, and the silence. There in the silence, I love the green grass. Well, he comes at nature not only in the silence of his own heart, but with a certain openness to it, as though it will speak if he gives it a chance. He comes at it out of a love, a care, a reverence. That's a good word for it, a reverence for the nature, because finally, as we see, it is God's nature. It's God's message to us, God's communication to us. So it starts out with nature just isn't there. It's just the garden is a gift. Garden is a gift. And therefore, one has to reverence it in some way. And then it is, although maybe it didn't come out so clearly here, there are ways, too, in which, for him, the rough spots of nature, the tortured gestures of the apple trees, the tortured gestures. I mean, I take it, it comes across as that the nature is not always symmetrical. It's not always perfect. You know, the tree gropes for its existence. And so the tree, doesn't look perfect, but that's part of its beauty. Beauty comes in the tortured gesture of the apple tree. So that maybe when we're trying to drink it in, the angry Lake Erie might be one of the things that touches us. Or maybe even the tediousness of the flatland. No? Maybe you don't have to go to San Francisco to get it. That would speak a different message, wouldn't it? But maybe there's something to be seen in the tediousness, in the boredom of the flatland. If you can find it in the tortured gestures of the apple tree. Part of what he does to make this work is to put aside all the useful things. Notice, he says, he's sitting on the cedar log and so on, and he doesn't reflect on the plans to make this a place of prayer. In other words, he could be sitting there thinking, how are we going to transport those logs over here, and where are we going to build this thing? How are we going to get it up? And I suspect that a lot of us would resonate with that when we try to get silence or quiet the heart, plans take over. How are we going to construct? How are we going to do? How are we going to accomplish? And one of the reasons Merton, it seems, is able to get in touch with nature is he puts that aside. And why? Because this place will get built when it gets built. They will happen when they will happen, he says. In other words, what is happening here, he's sort of let go of the plan. He's not fighting it anymore. He doesn't care, in a way, when it gets built. And because he doesn't care about that, he can drink in what is happening. And then, finally, this is the most telling passage I think I read for you here. And it's for those who want it, it's in the Thomas Merton Reader, page 207 to 208. That's one way it's accessible. I want to go back and look at it. Then he says, God is in his transparent world. He's here. God's present in everything. He's present in nature. Nature's a marvelous catalyst. But, a large but here, he is too sacred to be mentioned. There's a reticence here about claiming too much. There's a reticence about speaking the name of God too quickly. Too holy to be observed. This God that's present in nature will always be bigger than we could imagine, beyond what we might expect, bigger than all of our images and words. And it's because that God is so big and large and powerful and beyond and transcendent that there's no end to how the message could come to us through nature. It's in no way limited. This catalyst, this medium, can speak over and over and in different ways without ever exhausting. What it suggests, to me at least, is this need to be zeroed in and to be contemplating, to be aware of particular aspects of nature. Everyone recognizes the opposite of this. I mean, it's running through the woods quickly, or trying to drink in everything we can see. Merton suggests a very different letting go type of approach, where one would walk aimlessly and spend as much time as you wanted looking at one tree and say, I don't need to see the rest of the trees or the rest of the garden. One corner of the garden will be enough. I promised a little break. Yeah, what I think I'm going to do is invite the one-to-one discussion, and then people can still get home for the start of whichever program they're watching. I am going to spend just a little bit more time on the other negative critique, which is the nuclear weaponry. And it won't be a long section, but we're going to do the one-to-one discussion now and make it very comfortable for people to get up and go. And then I will do a short presentation on that last part, and we'll see if there's any questions. Let's do the one-to-one for a couple minutes. Before a number of people have left, I should have asked, you can still ask one, how many people here were not here last week? Did you raise your hand? You were not here last week. Oh my heavens. No wonder we ran out of things. Well, that's interesting. Huh. Well, we had even more than this here last week. Oh. We'll have to make some more of those things. We will meet again next week for if anybody wants to return. The third shift will be in. That's right. We will meet next Sunday in here, and then after that there's 2 on Tuesday night, so people remember that. And anyone is welcome. Newcomers always welcome. These things are sort of autonomous units. Doesn't matter if you're at one or the other. We'll be talking about personal relationships next time. Let me complete this aspect of nature technology that, from Merton's viewpoint, the hills are blue and hot. There's a brown, dusty field in the bottom of the valley. I hear a machine, a bird, a cloud. The clouds are high and enormous. Through them, the inevitable jet plane passes. This time probably full of passengers from Miami to Chicago. What passengers? This I have no need to decide. They are out of my world, up there, busy sitting in their small, isolated, arbitrary lounge that does not even seem to be moving, the lounge that somehow unaccountably picked them up off the earthen floor to suspend them for a while with timeless cocktails and then let them down in Illinois. The suspension of modern life in contemplation, that gets you somewhere. You've seen the playoff against the technology and so on. Contemplation, that gets you a plane. That's right, you get from one place to the other. But what really gets you someplace is contemplation. There are also other worlds above me. Other jets will pass over with other contemplations and other modalities of intentness. I have seen the SAC planes, strategic. Thank you. I have seen the SAC plane with the bomb in it fly low over me, and I have looked up out of the woods directly at the closed bay of the metal bird with a scientific egg in its breast. A womb easily and mechanically open. I do not consider this technological mother to be the friend of anything I believe in. However, like everyone else, I live in the shadow of the apocalyptic cherub. I am surveyed by it impersonally. Its number recognizes my number. Are these numbers preparing at some moment to coincide in the benevolent mind of a computer? This does not concern me, for I live in the woods as a reminder that I am free not to be a number. There is, in fact, a choice. Well, it goes on, it's called Day of a Stranger. It goes on to talk a lot about the nature and being in nature and so on. And then at the very end of it he says, after looking at nature, absorbing it, meanwhile the metal cherub plane, the sack bomber of the apocalypse, passes over me in the clouds, treasuring its egg and its message. Well, for Merton, the problem is that technology is often associated with violence. Merton sees technology very often doing violence to our personhood. They're giving people devices to hurt one another. And of course that is magnified then into the nuclear weapons. So for him, nuclear weaponry is technology run wild, gone crazy. It makes no sense. He talks about the inane statement from his viewpoint that you're going to make people safer by building more weapons. In Merton's frame of reference, that statement makes no sense. You're going to save people, make people safe by building more weapons. So Merton used this whole analysis of technology as part of his anti-nuclear crusade. Spoke out against nuclear weaponry. During the Second Vatican Council, he wrote to people in Rome and tried to get them to strengthen the statements in the pastoral letter that the bishops, that the council was producing, strengthened its statements against nuclear weaponry, spoke out strongly. In fact, he was silenced in the 60s. The Roman Curia decided that he was too strong in his statements, and they refused him permission to write anything about peace and war. And so it was, I think I said this before, but after a period of time he kept bombarding them and trying to get permission and so on, and finally they gave him permission to write about peace, but not war. So he used this opportunity to good advantage. So he's a strong strong pacifist in many ways, although I must point out that he had troubles with the peace movement in the United States and with their purity, as he called it. Do you remember when Roger Laporte burned himself at the United Nations in protest against war and so on? It was back in the early 60s, as I recall it. Well, Merton was just horribly shaken by that. He sent letters that very day to certain peace organizations that he wanted out. That any kind of lunatic action like that, he didn't want to be any part of. And he really hurt the feelings of many people. He wrote within a couple days letters of apology about that and said he had overreacted. There's no doubt that what he thought of as the lunatic fringe of the peace movement disturbed him greatly. He didn't think that that was the way to go. He was against violence of all kinds. Oh, he was against, he had a great sense of the sacredness of human life. This burning oneself did not make sense to him. And Merton would not go totally with the pacifist position. He felt that there was times when force was needed, and his great example of that was the Hungarian Revolution. He hated totalitarianism so much and loved freedom so much that he didn't want to take weapons out of the hands of the freedom fighters. He could not adopt a totally pacifist position. He took the position that there were times when the stakes were so high, the violence so great, the totalitarianism so controlling, that violence might be needed to overcome that. That's incidentally the position of Paul Rahner as well on this kind of question. So Merton was, and that hurt people like the Berrigan brothers, caused a rift with people like Dorothy Day at times. the really total pacifist in the Catholic peace movement in the United States. Merton had trained many of those people. They had come to Gethsemane and sought his wisdom. He had gathered conferences with them, but he was not pure enough at times for those people in the peace movement. But despite those caveats and those ways that he interjected again the just war theory, he himself, fought against nuclear weaponry and wrote against it. And you see in the poetic passage that I read how he said that is no friend of mine. That's totally opposed to my values, opposed to what I hold dear, and so on. It was, and he came at it from one angle, technology. See what it has done. See what science has produced here. This possibility now of ultimately destroying ourselves. For him, that was indictment enough of the machine in the garden. The machine had come into the garden and now had the possibility of destroying the whole garden. And that, for Merton, was intolerable. The garden was home. The garden was where you found God. The garden was part of the American dream. It was part of the Christian notion, the return to Eden, to paradise, to a pure world that's simple and not complex, that where reality can be taken in, absorbed, and can speak to us of God. The machine is dangerous as it can destroy the garden. Well, so Merton, what does Merton do, therefore? He issues a challenge, I suppose, as always. It's so strong that maybe it shakes up our perceptions of things. Maybe it would, as I reflect on where we might go with it, one of the strong positive things for me is his call for silence and solitude and to get away from the busyness, and especially the usefulness of accomplishing and just to be with reality. And I choose the word reality there rather than nature as a bridge to my other more negative comment, and that is, it seems to me, I indicated this before, that the machine also can reveal something of God. The machine, after all, is a product of human intelligence. It's a product of industry and science and hard work. God gave us intelligence and meant us to tend the garden and to find our ways of enhancing the garden. And in so many ways, I think that happens. We think of all the labor-saving devices, as was said before, all of the machines that have freed us up, possibility of technology helping us to feed the world, feed people maybe for the first time in history. At least, that power is within our hands because of the advance of science and technology. The communications have reduced the globe. It is technology that's enabled us to look from outer space at this globe of ours and to understand we're on spaceship Earth with a common destiny. It's helped us to see that nationalism doesn't make any sense when this one globe is floating in space, excessive nationalism that becomes an idol. No, it's technology that's enabled us to communicate with people far away, to see those suffering children, see the image in our television screen of the small child too weak to push the flies away in Ethiopia. Something that can touch our hearts and did touch our hearts and move us to give and to help those people. No, it's the whole world of communications, again, that would make something like live aid possible and to mobilize us. It gets us around the world, it gets us in touch with other cultures. We today know more about, say, Hinduism and what goes on in India than the great people who went before us. Thomas Aquinas' world was very small. He was a great thinker, but he had a small world to deal with in the 13th century. Theologians today have tried to do their work in a bigger world. We know about Buddhism and Muslims and Hinduism, largely because of the advances of technology. Technology, it seems to me, can reveal to us as well the power of the great God. Well, we have our telescopes now, giant telescopes probing space, telling us about that new galaxy they just discovered. So many millions of light years away. And it begins to give one, create a sense of awe and wonder as much as staring at a leaf for some people. So for some people that would open up the mystery of God in a way that a walk in the woods might not. So to me, it seems that one needs to see the ambivalence of technology. Well, one has to see, of course, Merton's negative critique makes sense. Well, we do have pollution. We have scientism that wants to make a God out of the scientific method. We've got the nuclear weaponry. We've got people thinking that they're machines because they work with computers and think other people are machines and can be put on 3x5 cards or computer printouts. It has depersonalized in many ways, there's no doubt about it. But at the same time, technology has freed people up, provided more leisure, given us greater opportunity to contemplate the mysteries of God, opened up for us a larger world, expanded our horizons. It itself has become a catalyst for the revelation of God's Spirit. That's at least my own thought on that. That's where I would go with the Merton critique, and where I would try to work out my own sense of this. And then, it seems to me, that what is valuable about Merton is much of what I said last time. It's like Merton kept thinking if he could get to Alaska, he'd be fine, or get to a hermitage and he'd be fine, and but he always found out that wherever he was, people would bug him. So my theory of that, or where I take that, is you've got to carry the hermitage within us. You've got to carry the quiet space into the office. We meditate 15 minutes a day so we can stay calm throughout the rest of the day and deal with people in an appropriate way. We pray in order so that as we do our work, we can find a deeper meaning in it. And here, what I would say the same way is that what Merton attunes us to is a love of nature, and something that perhaps we're able to do periodically, like take a quiet, slow drive and the beautiful leaves and drink it in, or go camping for a week, or climb mountains for a while, or go sit by the ocean and make a retreat, or just get off quietly by ourselves for a while. We can do that, and maybe we gain some appreciation of what Merton is saying, but then you've got to carry the garden with us. We don't live in a garden. We never will live in a garden. We live in an urban area, most of us, or we live in a technologized world, and we'll live the rest of our life in that kind of world. Also, we got to figure out how to carry the garden within us. The appreciation of nature inside of us, carry that with us as we go through our day. Again, Merton represents a monastic spirituality. You can't transport a monastic spirituality for people like you and me who live busy lives and got a lot to do and live in urban areas, etc. You can't do that. That's a danger. We tried to do that with priests and nuns for years. Seminary training was based on that. You're going to put you in a monastery for 8 years or something and then send you out and think you're going to continue to live like that. Everyone looks at you like you're from outer space or something. Well, we got to figure out just how to do it now, here, and not pine for some idyllic world. Great Gatsby is very interesting in this regard. A novel I think is a great American novel, but it's all based on this idea of the dream to get back to the Severs. Remember at the end of the novel when he looks out at the green light at the end of the dock on Long Island, and there's that statement that when the Dutch came here, they saw this vast land, this green breast filled with life. It was an idyllic world, a new continent. It was tremendous. They could do anything with it. It wasn't polluted and so on. And Gatsby has that dream. Like that dream, he can go back and relate to Daisy as he did 5 years before. He says, of course you can repeat the past. Nick says, well, you can't repeat the past. And Gad says, well, what do you mean? Of course you can repeat the past. Of course you can go back to the past. And of course Fitzgerald in the novel is telling us that's ridiculous. You can't do that. The automobile kills the woman, comes and kills Gatsby. You can't repeat it. And that's a great American dream that lurks in the heart in a way, in my mind. It's that idyllic dream, get back to the pure garden. And I think that keeps us from doing what we could do. That is, carry the garden with us in some way. And we'll have it in our heart and in our mind and our perception of things. And then we would be able to maybe deal with the technologized world in a more personalized, more human fashion. I think that's enough. I feel like just stopping, and I think therefore I will follow my rhythms and do that. See you next week.